Welcome to the PIDE webinar. As you know, we try and get you the best of people so that we can remain in the global thought stream. We want to make sure that every Pakistani is able to hear the best in economics and public policy that we can find. So today I'm very pleased to say that we've got somebody that I admire a lot, who's contributed a lot to the development literature. Dr. Lant Pritchett is a visiting professor of practice in London School of Economics, my old school. He has also worked as the associate of state building capacity and RISE research director at the University of Oxford. He has worked at the World Bank and Harvard University. He has been part of the teams that have produced very good World Bank reports. In fact, his two or three famous things. One thing that I'll get him to talk about later, is this wonderful phrase that he's coined that we used a lot, which is isomorphic mimicry. That's Lant's phrase, so we must owe him that. We owe him in a big way on that because that's a beautiful phrase. But he's also did this famous paper that I really loved, which is where has all this education gone, which is also a very important paper. He's he's a leading development economist with many, many publications. I think every Pakistani knows him. He's written on economic growth, education, labor mobility, many things, and done a great job, one of the leading thinkers in this area. His empirical development economics is excellent. He's worked on economic reform, international migration, poverty, social policy and development. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. We've got one of the best people in development economics here. Please get your questions ready. Challenge him, question him. That's how we learn. And Lant loves to be challenged and questioned. Lant, you also owe us something on this wave that has happened, the what do you call it? These randomized controlled trials. You have a great piece on that too. We must talk about that someday, but not today. Today, Lant is talking about $1 a day poverty was a development mileage marker, but not a destination. It's an intriguing paper. I'm waiting to hear about it. I will not stand between you and the speaker. Lant, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I apologize that I'm not joining you in person. I struggled to make the logistics of working in all the things, but it was mainly the travel, the travel constraint. I actually in real time became the binding constraint. So this is the first time I have presented this particular paper. You see the first draft was just completed a month ago, and I had, in some sense, written this paper to present for this occasion in Pakistan, as I think Pakistan is in some ways a paradigm of what's going on. So let me share screen. The title of the presentation is Development is Poverty Reduction, but Poverty Reduction is not development. And the fundamental premise of this is that in my mind, either the use of $1 a day poverty as a primary metric of what development and development economics is about has to die, or development economics dies. We have led ourselves down a pathway that is at a very serious dead end, and we have to figure out a way out of that in order for an endeavor-like development as an activity, as an idea, as development assistance organizations, as a practice, and as a meaningful subcomponent of a discipline will disappear. So how am I going to get there? So I'm going to by looking at the paper as how I present it, I'm just going to start with a very simple simulation exercise that just asks if there were economic growth in the 13 largest developing countries in the world that account for something like 60% of all the population in the developing world, if those countries by some mechanism had positive growth, how much of the benefits would go to the poor? And the answer is, if we take the most commonly widely used $1 a day inheritor poverty line, the answer is almost none of the benefits of growth in developing countries go to the poor. So it means you can't justify economic growth as an objective on the premise that it is actually that the benefits of that mainly or principally or even predominantly go to the poor, which means you are either going to get people who say, therefore, we don't need economic growth. What we need is anti-poverty programs, and we need to design anti-poverty programs, and those programs need to be effective. And that's, in the end, the whole RCT thing is a symptom of a much larger disease with the conceptualization of development. So we either need to give up on economic growth or we need to give up on dollar-a-day poverty. And I argue that we really need to give up on dollar-a-day poverty because dollar-a-day poverty is stupid and dollar-a-day poverty is evil. And, you know, if you're both stupid and evil, those are good arguments for giving it up. So we need to reject the kind of overwhelming tendency that has dominated the discourse coming from the West and the North for the last 30 years to define development down, to reconceptualize the development project as meeting certain very low bar standards like dollar-a-day poverty or like universal primary schooling, and get back. And because if we go that way, then development stops being about development and economics stops being economics. Economics turns into plumbing of this, you know, micro design as opposed to the development thing. So let me just, I'm going to start with the results. And I'll just describe the results. You can read the paper, but it's pretty straightforward. I take a simulated log normal distribution of consumption per capita in each of the 13 largest countries of the world. And then I just say, if it were the case that we had either a distributionally neutral shift or a pro-poor shift, and we'll get back to that later. Let's talk first about a distributionally neutral shift. So we had what could easily be called inclusive growth. Just somehow the consumption of every individual in the economy, every household went up in an equiproportionate equal percentage gain for all households. So hence distributionally neutral by most measures. How much would the total gains be? And then how much of those gains would go to the poor? And again, this is just almost, it's kind of an arithmetic calculation. The total gain in GDP would be $2.3 trillion. So that's a huge amount. And then if we ask how much of that gain...
Lant, very quickly, can I just interrupt a little?
Sure,
Are you sure you've got the right slides and the slides should be moving, or are you focused on one slide only?
No, I'm on a slide with orange bars. Are you seeing a slide with orange bars?
With orange bars, with yeah, 2 orange bars and a green bar.
There's a bunch of orange bars, right?
No. This is lines actually. Green lines and orange lines and blue lines. It says here are some long run spell growth incidence curves from WB data on consumption. Is that the one?
No.
The slides that you sent me are different.
So the answer is, if somehow we have this enormous success and every country in the world had a 10% augmentation, and 10% doesn't really matter, it could be 80%, but 10% augmentation of their distributionally neutral shift, so everybody could consume more of everything, that would be a $2.3 trillion gain. But then if we ask how much of that gain goes to the extreme poor or the dollar-a-day poor, which is now a poverty line of $2.15 in, I think, 2017 PPP prices, amazingly, only 58 billion of 2.5 trillion in gains would go to the poor. So, and that is only 2.5%. So the factual description would be that of this gain, only 2.5 cents of every dollar of the gains from growth in the developing world went to the poor. And therefore, if you had said, I am going to, as an instrument to a target, accelerate growth and cause this 10% growth in order to reduce poverty, advocates could easily point out how radically inefficient and ineffective your means of achieving poverty reduction are, because only 2.5 cents on every dollar had gone to the poor. So in some sense, by defining a low bar poverty line, you have made it such that broad-based improvements can't go to the poor, and then if you ask, how can it be that we had 2.3 trillion in gains and only 58 billion went to the poor? The answer, and go to the next slide, is someone. The answer is kind of easy arithmetic. The problem is that the dollar a day line is so incredibly low and penurious that in the major developing countries, there are just very few dollar a day poor. So first of all, broad-based growth can't benefit the poor very much if there aren't very many of them. So if you look at this table, the FGT is the Foster-Beer-Thorbecke measure of poverty, which is just the standard measure of head count poverty. And it says, and this is where the simulation versus the reality gets a little dicey, but I've just re-simulated a distribution so I can do the arithmetic with the distribution. But it says in India, only 15% of people are dollar a day poor, and in Pakistan, only 9.8% of people are dollar a day poor. This is my simulation. The actual data says only 4.9% of people in Pakistan are dollar a day poor. So the first thing is, well, first of all, not a lot of the benefit can go to the poor. If only 5% of your population is poor by this threshold, well, the maximum, it just can't be that much of it goes to the poor because there aren't very many of them. And then the second thing is that the poor by definition are poor. And what it means to be poor is you have low consumption, which means the share of the 5% of people who are poor isn't 5%. It's some tiny fraction. It's a much smaller fraction because they're poorer than the average. So if you just said, again, if you look at the column that's in the table, these are the cumulative distribution curves of the simulated consumption of each of these places. It just says in Pakistan, on the simulated data, only 9.8% are poor, but they only control 3.4% of the income because the poor are considerably poorer than the average, which means a distributionally neutral shift is only going to lead to 3.4 cents on every dollar of economic per capita growth in Pakistan going to the poor. And then turns out Pakistan is relative to other large countries like China, where growth is where poverty is lower, Indonesia, where poverty is lower, Brazil, where poverty is lower. And so there just there's very few big developing countries that actually have very many dollar a day poor. And then secondly, just by the nature of being poor, the poor have smaller shares of income, so their marginal share of a distribution is going to be very small. So next slide. So if you had said the point of development economics is poverty reduction, which sounds like a reasonable thing to say, and then if you had said the way I define poverty for poverty reduction is dollar a day poverty, you would have really compelling evidence that economic growth is not an effective or cost-effective means of achieving poverty reduction, because so much of the benefits of growth don't accrue to the poor. And then you would be off the races of redefining development economics to be about the structure of poverty programs and the efficacy of poverty programs and behavioral stuff. And targeted programs. And then the efficacy of targeted programs would become a key issue. And then evidence about the efficacy of targeted programs would become an issue. And an RCT would be a reasonable tool for you to use to address that. But that's exactly wrong. That's exactly wrong. In the sense that should we pay therefore less attention to growth? And the answer is no, because growth is radically important for every component of human well-being and poverty reduction in the first place. And second, dollar-a-day poverty lines are both stupid and evil. So what do I mean by that? Next slide.
Next slide.
So first of all, if you just ask yourself, say we actually took dollar-a-day poverty as the goal, what explains the variation across time and space in dollar-a-day poverty? And the answer is, if you know the median of the distribution of the country at a time and place, you know the poverty line with an R squared of 0.988. So the first fact about the world is the only thing headcount poverty is correlated with is the median. Once you have controlled for the median, the income of the typical individual, the residual variation around the residual differences between poverty and the median is essentially zero. I mean, 0.8988 that's as close to 1 as you can get in real world data. I mean, often, if you take two different measures of infant mortality in countries, the correlation is 0.95. So the correlation between the median and the headcount poverty, and if you understood targeted programs as some mechanism of closing the bottom tail towards the median, those play empirically no role in poverty reduction, either in levels, which is illustrated on the left-hand side as you look at it. Those are the levels for various poverty lines from the dollar a day to twice that to the high line, or in changes. So the other figure shows if you look at changes in poverty over time, again, changes in poverty over time are perfect, the coefficient of predicted changes and actual changes, predicted changes from the median and actual changes is 1, and the R squared is 0.93. So second, next slide. Second, another recent paper I've done is let's construct an index of the basic human needs. So I construct an index that takes cross-national indicators about basic health, basic education, sanitation, 6 or 7 different domains of well-being, physical indicators, so I'm not. And then if you ask, what's the relationship between meeting basic needs in a country and just GDP per capita? Every way you do it, reasons for that we can come back to. And this graph has the consequence that the correlation, the association between economic growth and basic needs is just very tight, very strong, and it's very nonlinear. So economic growth is just super important for basics at low levels of if you look at the vertical line at the 80th percentile or sort of the rich countries, it's of course flattens out because you've met your basic needs. But you basically it's a very strong, very nonlinear relationship in which economic growth is the predominant driving force. And the imagination that you can meet basic needs without economic growth just isn't borne out in the data at all. Or the idea that you would have rapid economic growth and not meet basic needs is also those colored lines are envelopment graphs. Those are sort of every country in the world fits inside those graphs. So there's really not that much variation once you account for GDP. Next slide. And if you go further and say, let's build kind of some omnibus indicator, and this organization called the Social Progress Institute has built the Social Progress Index, and they built it because they hated economics. So they said, economists are far too focused on economic growth and economic things, and they really should focus on direct measures of well-being like undernourishment and literacy and rights like freedom of speech. And so they built an index of social progress. And I said, okay, let's take this index of social progress that most people would agree these things in these long lists are good things for people to have. And let's see how much of the how much of the variation over time in their economics free measure of well-being is actually associated with economic development. Now here I'm expanding my definition of development to be GDP per capita, state capability, and a responsive polity measured in this case by a stock of democracy. So I have three factors. I'm just regressing social progress on the left-hand side on GDP per capita, state capability, and a responsive polity, which I take as the core of the national development process. Again, all of the variation across countries in this omnibus indicator of well-being is roughly absorbed by national development. So the left-hand side shows you the regression. The right-hand side, again, I created this graph I call an envelopment diagram. And the thing about an envelopment diagram is it sort of emphasizes that all of the experience of all countries in the world fits inside this narrow envelope. So if these were uncorrelated, the envelope would be the whole space, where in this diagram, what's important is the white space. No country is in the northwest of that diagram. No country has high social progress and low national development. And conversely, no country has high national development and doesn't achieve high social progress. So the country level process of national development is in fact accurately described as an engine of producing high levels of human well-being. And the idea that you can drive sort of due north in this diagram, that you can achieve high levels of social progress without national development, it's faith-based, if anything. It's probably a fantasy, but at best it's faith-based. There aren't examples. Sure, there's variation, but there aren't examples of any country achieving, say, Argentina's level of social well-being without having very near Argentina level of national development. So we shouldn't replace economic growth as a measure of how we're going to improve human well-being, because it's a hugely important driver of poverty, of basic needs, and of overall social welfare. So if we're going to give up on growth or low dollar-a-day poverty, let's give up on dollar-a-day poverty. Now, in addition, there's good reasons to give up on dollar-a-day poverty. Next slide. You know, you might say, how can you say dollar-a-day poverty lines are stupid? Everybody uses them. They're all over the place. Everybody talks about it. Yeah, but everybody talks about it. But, you know, people used to believe in fairies too. So, you know, but fundamentally, I say it's stupid because the actual analytical implications of using a poverty line, no one really believes in. In the sense, there are three implications of using a poverty line. If you say, my social objective, my objective to achieve, that's my normative ranking of what I'm trying to achieve, is some X dollar a day poverty, it implies three things. First, it implies a discontinuity where there isn't one. Meaning, if you take the derivative of poverty with respect to income, it's positive below the poverty line and exactly zero above the poverty line. So that imposes this discontinuity that just treats two individuals that are on the just opposite sides of the poverty line radically different, because one of them, their gain counts for something, and one of them just above that line counts for exactly zero. So that there's just, whereas in the actual space of human well-being, everybody knows that doesn't exist. Like nobody in the history of mankind has held a party because they're above the dollar-a-day poverty line and they're somehow better off just being, you know, $1.01. Second, a poverty line is going to treat radically different individuals as if they were the same. Meaning, if I take a person just above the poverty line and I take Bill Gates and ask, what's the derivative of my welfare function with respect to increase of the income of those two people? It's exactly the same because it's both exactly zero. So I'm counting a just non-poor person and Bill Gates as exactly the same. Well, that's just a mistake. No one believes that's a sensible way to think about the world. And then third, a poverty line treats well-being, the only difference poverty approach and a social welfare function approach or any other weighted aggregate approach is that it has a line and treats gains above that line as zero, and it treats the income gains to the well-being gains to people as if they were zero when they're totally not. And the problem is the dollar a day line is stupid because it makes all these three mistakes be as big as they can possibly be. If you said, let's choose a poverty line that makes the total poverty lines the worst, that makes the discontinuity seem the stupidest, that makes the treatment of very different people as if they were same the worst, and treats income gains as zero when they're really not. To some extent, the lower you push the poverty line, the worse all three of those problems are. So next slide. So this just sort of takes a hypothetical question, and assumes that kind of our well-being function is log income, right? So the orange line is the derivative of well-being with respect to incremental consumption, normed so that it's equal to 1 at the dollar a day poverty line, right? And then we can calculate the discontinuity. The discontinuity is the difference between the orange line and zero just above the poverty line, right? And you can see that discontinuity is huge at the dollar a day poverty line, because no matter how you slice it, you've gone from high marginal utility because you're still very poor at the dollar a day plus epsilon. So you go from high to zero at the poverty line. So the discontinuity is huge. And then secondly, if you think of the discrepancy, so we're going to treat somebody at $2.16, which is again the normalized dollar a day line, and somebody at, say, Denmark's median of $58, we're going to treat a typical OECD citizen and somebody at 216 the same, but the discrepancy between their well-being is enormous, just enormous. So we're treating people that are almost identical completely different, and people that are completely different as if they're the same by our poverty analysis. And again, just imagine how bad this problem is at the dollar a day line, at the World Bank's high line of $6.80, or at a very high line of $21.5, which is just 10 times the line, but we'll get back to that. You can see that you can just see now intuitively, the lower we make the poverty line, the less poverty analysis reflects anything about the world. We just don't have a well-being function that's being adequately represented by low-bar poverty lines. It's just wrong. No one believes it. No one can take the actual analytical implications of dollar-a-day poverty lines seriously. They're just not serious ways of describing human well-being or a social objective. Next slide. And I'm just about done. I've tried to limit the slides, so I leave. I'm telling you, everything you've ever heard about poverty is wrong. So I realize that's going to evoke some reactions and questions. But the second thing is, if you ask yourself, okay, I'm going to have a measure of well-being, and maybe my measure of well-being is distribution sensitive. I care more about poor people than richer people. Then you can imagine I'm going to aggregate well-being not by income, but by the elasticity of well-being with respect to income at various income levels, where we'd expect that to be sort of downward sloping. So what this graph shows is a simulated distribution of I've simulated Pakistan's distribution of income. So it's roughly located where Pakistan actually is. And then there's a whole bunch of other lines in this graph. And all of the green lines are various ways of thinking about what would an indicator of well-being look like. So for instance, one of the dashed green lines is what's the elasticity at various levels of country GDP with respect to basic needs. So we might say what we're going to do is we're going to emphasize the growth of countries according to whether that economic growth actually leads to meeting human needs. And we're going to therefore discount growth for high income countries and weight income of low income countries. The challenge becomes that the reality is that in the estimated data, the elasticity of well-being with respect to income looks like it's the same or even rising over all of the relevant ranges of income for Pakistan. So even if you go out and say, what's the 90th percentile Pakistani, how should we weight the gain to a statistically rich 90th percent Pakistani, the data say for a person for countries at that level of income, the increment of meeting basic needs with respect to income is still very high. It's not declining, and it's nowhere near zero. So if poverty analysis were a sensible thing, these elasticities of well-being would be sharply downward sloping and would intersect. They would go to something like zero, somewhere near $2.15. The world is completely the opposite of that. People continue to benefit in child mortality. Yeah, I mean, I've done it with child mortality, with malnutrition, with the social progress index, with basic needs. Any indicator you want to take and that are widely used as indicators of well-being as things we should focus on, the increment to gain of that with respect to income is still very, very high at levels of income much, much higher, 10 times higher than dollar-a-day poverty. So the claim that we could approximate someone's increment to well-being at dollar a day by zero is wrong. So I'm about to wrap up. Next slide. And by the way, this slide, I'm going to kind of skip it in the interest of time, but the whole pro-poor thing doesn't really make a big difference. And this is just giving the intuition why pro-poor doesn't make any difference. Is the problem with why most of the benefit doesn't go to poor isn't the distribution of income. It isn't the distribution of the growth, it's the distribution of income. If there are few poor and the poor have few of the things, even if the proportionate rate of growth is high, their absolute rate of growth is very low. Next slide. Okay, so now the last thing I'm going to say is the most controversial. I'm going to say two more. I think there's just two more slides. You know, low bar poverty rates became globally popular because they're wrong. They became popular because they're wrong about the world, but the rich world wanted to hear it. The rich world wanted to back away from a previous commitment to national development that countries like Pakistan and India and China would become full and equal players in the global sphere, and their citizens would become just as prosperous as rich countries. They wanted to back away that commitment and still look good. So they said, no. What development was really about was, reducing this definition of poverty that was very, very low. It was an escape valve for them to shed themselves of true commitments to development. And so the reason dollar-a-day poverty line became popular is not because it was good economics, not because it was good domestic politics for governments of developing countries. It was just because rich countries wanted it. And they wanted it because they could pretend they still had some altruistic commitment to development while redefining a development that made no sense to people actually in developing countries. So last slide, I think. Well, which leads you to this RCT, let's do a project stuff, which I think I'm hoping the audience is pretty sympathetic to. Compared to the long run consequences of growth, you can't cash transfer your way into high productivity and prosperity. Like, so all this attention to transfer programs and livelihoods, it's all just irrelevant in the long run. So I just give an example of a recent paper where, they had shown some cost-effective treatment of poverty, but it was just, yes, it was statistically significant and might have been cost effective, but it was trivial compared to what economic growth can produce. Last slide, hopefully, so I could really wrap up in 40 minutes. So now, why is the first place I'm presenting this paper of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics? Because I'm losing. I'm a loser, maybe, but I'm completely losing the debate about what development is about and what development economics is about. And so, if you go to a typical Western-based conference on development economics, it's no longer about development, it's about charity work, and it's no longer about economics, it's about the techniques of plumbing. The big picture issues that constituted the challenges developing countries have to make the national development transition. Nobody's researching, nobody's talking about it. I actually submitted this paper to the BRED conference and they rejected it because it wasn't interesting to them. And what was interesting, the 16 papers that were chosen, they're all trivial. They're all completely trivial. No one in Pakistan cares about the answers to any of them. So in the end, the only people that can change this is unfair to Pakistan and India and China and Indonesia, but the only people that can change this are Pakistan. You have to just start saying no. Just say no. No. Poverty is, low bar poverty. You invented that shit. It's on you. We're not taking that. We're not accepting that as what Pakistan is about. Pakistan is about becoming a full and equal country in the world of countries. We want full development. We want exactly what the US has, what the UK has, what Germany has, and nothing short of that is our goal. And just say no to development economics that's the handmaiden of billionaires who want to prove they're doing cost-effective charity. That's what development economics is increasingly becoming, and it's just crap. It's just not what helps people in Pakistan answer questions that are important to Pakistan. Let me stop there. I think that lays out enough to create some questions and discussion. Well, which leads you to this RCT, let's do a project stuff, which I think I'm hoping the audience is pretty sympathetic to. Compared to the long run consequences of growth, you can't cash transfer your way into high productivity and prosperity. Like, so all this attention to transfer programs and livelihoods, it's all just irrelevant in the long run. So I just give an example of a recent paper where, they had shown some cost-effective treatment of poverty, but it was just, yes, it was statistically significant and might have been cost effective, but it was trivial compared to what economic growth can produce. Last slide, hopefully, so I could really wrap up in 40 minutes. So now, why is the first place I'm presenting this paper of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics? Because I'm losing. I'm a loser, maybe, but I'm completely losing the debate about what development is about and what development economics is about. And so, if you go to a typical Western-based conference on development economics, it's no longer about development, it's about charity work, and it's no longer about economics, it's about the techniques of plumbing. The big picture issues that constituted the challenges developing countries have to make the national development transition. Nobody's researching, nobody's talking about it. I actually submitted this paper to the BRED conference and they rejected it because it wasn't interesting to them. And what was interesting, the 16 papers that were chosen, they're all trivial. They're all completely trivial. No one in Pakistan cares about the answers to any of them. So in the end, the only people that can change this is unfair to Pakistan and India and China and Indonesia, but the only people that can change this are Pakistan. You have to just start saying no. Just say no. No. Poverty is, low bar poverty. You invented that shit. It's on you. We're not taking that. We're not accepting that as what Pakistan is about. Pakistan is about becoming a full and equal country in the world of countries. We want full development. We want exactly what the US has, what the UK has, what Germany has, and nothing short of that is our goal. and just say no to development economics that's the handmaiden of billionaires who want to prove they're doing cost-effective charity. That's what development economics is increasingly becoming, and it's just crap. It's just not what helps people in Pakistan answer questions that are important to Pakistan. Let me stop there. I think that lays out enough to create some questions and, and discussion.
Thank you, Lant. As always, Lant has been very provocative and creatively so. I don't think it's provocative without A, good research, and two, good thought. So, Lant, with that, I thank you for the presentation. I think it's wonderful. You have said stuff that kind of hits home. I mean, I hope you don't lose. I hope you win. Because yes, we agree with you entirely that development economics, sitting where we sit, that development economics is really off the racks. But let me just turn to this. I think this is wonderful what you said about poverty. We've been trying to get that message across. But the biggest problem here is that there is a whole industry that's invested in this. And it's a huge industry. And it's championed by none other than our former alma mater. I mean, in a sense, the World Bank is its goal is end poverty, which is an elusive goal, which will never finish. I mean, poverty can never be ended because it's a relative thing. It's not an absolute thing. So definitely there will always be poverty. In fact, the IMF has now got into poverty too. So there's no doubt about it. There's poverty. Poverty is a huge business. But then there's also not only $1 a day, there's also the UN stuff, which is called something multi-poverty, whatever. So this whole poverty industry that's growing indices, and we've got this in PIDE too. We do this too, and I've got lots of people to look into it. And we talked about, how do we even estimate that the poverty line means anything? Sujit Bhalla had a conversation with us when he was here, and we discussed poverty as well, because as he works in poverty a lot too, and like you, he's an iconoclast too. So I think I take your points very well. But tell me one thing: when you say economic growth, even on economic growth, we've got something which you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to draw your attention to it, which is isomorphic mimicry. Like even today, for example, the IFC is pushing upon us that we must have a Fannie Mae, and we have actually developed a Fannie Mae. A Fannie Mae. We've actually developed a Fannie Mae thanks to the IFC, right? Because the US has the Fannie Mae, despite the global crisis, we have developed a Fannie Mae. So talk about isomorphic mimicry, right? We have developed a social safety net the same way as the UK or something. We've been asked to do welfare programs, mimic the welfare programs of the US or Scandinavia, etc. I mean, both you and I have nothing against welfare, but the question is, can we just copy everything in the West? And can we just, as you said, think only of poverty? And I'm glad you talked about discontinuity. It's absolutely clear there's a discontinuity. And your analogy, like Bill Gates versus the marginally unpoor. I mean, both are sitting at very different. And welfare itself is a very, very different issue. For example, in PIDE, we have done a survey on, we've tried to do, we've got a survey that we are trying to analyze right now, which is talking about who are we, looking at social capital, well-being, etc., stuff that you've done. But we're doing it, we've got 20,000 observations. We'd love for you to come and help us do that too. So we've got these observations. And so some of the things that we find that in our rush to get rid of poverty, in our rush to build welfare programs, a couple of things that I'll tell you, and then we can go on. 86% of Pakistani kids have never seen a library. 70% of the boys have never seen a playground, a proper playground, not playing in the streets or parks, etc. A proper playground, like a basketball court or a volleyball court or simple things like that. Nothing, I'm not talking about anything fancy. And 100% of the girls have never seen a playground because they can't get out of the house. So we got huge problems, and these are all subsumed because in the name of poverty, that we're looking at poverty. So please, let's not worry about that. Let's do a cash transfer or a conditional cash transfer. But what we are in our survey, what we are finding is that the basic public goods required for a good childhood are just not here. And we are working on this thing that what are the public goods that, let's say, a child would require for the child to become a good, functioning, productive citizen. And one of the things that we miss out is productivity altogether. So just speak to this, that in a desire to end poverty, what are the big picture items that we are missing? And how would you look at them? And how would you expect us to recraft our research agenda to be able to focus on those big ticket items that you think are important?
Let me just respond, and then let's, I guess, move to more question and answer. I think just two things. First, I think isomorphism is the biggest disease of the development field, and it's just transplantation of, since the US has this and it's, a developed country, then you should have it. And it just got cause and effect completely backwards, right? I mean, it's sort of like, you could observe that rich people own Mercedes, but you don't become a rich person by my giving you a Mercedes, right? You become richer for sure. But so, and again, the thing that gets lost is that countries are at a level of income that the US last had in 1870. So, we should ask, how did the US get from 1870 to where it is today? And at what point in that did they really scale up social transfer and safety net programs, right? And the answer is not 1870. The answer is not 1900. And the answer is barely 1930, right? So I think the contextualness of what's the sequencing of things is hugely important. And I think the risk of the development process of linking rich worlds with poor world and having advisors drop in from rich world is that they don't properly understand the context. The second is, and this is maybe, I like the fact that you're emphasizing public goods. And the reason I like that you're emphasizing public goods is that the rhetoric about inequality is acting as if what is available to the middle class, upper middle class, or elite is actually really good, and the poor are being excluded from that. But it's exactly the opposite. What's lacking in countries with low state capability, and again, that's low GDP, low state what's lacking in countries with low national development, which is GDP and state capability and democracy, is that the system isn't working for nearly anyone. So I recently did a paper on learning outcomes in school, and what we see from the PISA D data that did PISA-like learning assessments in very poor countries is the country's elite are way below the SDG minimum level of learning. So it is not as if the problem is inclusion. The problem is the creation of the public good at all. And then if we're talking about the creation of the public good, we can't be talking sharp targeting. You don't get good public goods by sharp targeting. You don't get good public goods by starting with excluding and targeting for only the poor. You have to start constructing public goods by generating a public consensus around public goods. And that requires that the benefits be broad-based and shared, not that they be targeted. So again, the whole dollar a day assumption that poverty is a consequence of exclusion, poverty is a consequence of there being things but not adequately distributed, is just completely the wrong story about most countries with low national development. They don't have those things because they haven't generated a national development process that generates them as a result of the process, and hence dropping in and insisting on sharp targeting and insisting on cocoon programs is the opposite of working towards development. Sorry, before we take questions, I have to go get a charger and plug my computer in, or I'm going to lose this call in a few minutes.
Okay,
so
sure
give me
enough.
1 second.
Go ahead,
I'll be
we'll
right
wait.
back.
We'll wait.
Plug
Go
my
ahead.
computer.
So let me ask you, Lant, another question. We measure poverty from the point of view of consumption and from the point of view of income and other things. The one thing that we don't measure, which we've tried to measure in PIDE, is the poverty of opportunity. And we find that poverty of opportunity is extremely lacking. For example, the couple of things that we did was, we found, for example, that the footprint of the government, the markets in which the government interferes, it's roughly about 70% of GDP. and could be even 80% if we include urban regulation. We also looked at the cost of regulation, the permissions and the licenses that are required, and they turn out to be well over GDP. So there's a huge amount of regulatory barriers. We also tried to do something else, which is very interesting. We looked at the street vending situation in Pakistan. And we actually worked a lot on it. And street vending is severely limited by regulation. So we began to look at the poverty of opportunity. We look at these, for example, graduate students in Pakistan, I mean, not graduate, but graduates in Pakistan, and the unemployment rate is far higher than the rest. I mean, this goes back to your paper that I loved, which is where has all the education gone? Because these graduates, the unemployment rate is something like 35%, if I remember right. And PhDs, we've also got into this big business of creating PhDs. We're creating a lot of PhDs. And 50% of the PhDs are unemployed. So, and the rest of the world also is giving us a lot of scholarships. For example, lots of people go to Harvard, even Cambridge, lots of people go to Chinese universities. I mean, the Pakistani students are full because you have a population, young populations of every university they're going to. But when they come back, they're unemployed unless they can stay there. So the poverty of opportunity that we look at, and one thing we also see that because there's no opportunity, people are turning to more and more education. So people are staying on till 35, 40, just trying to stay in university so that they can do something productive and hoping that the next degree will get them something. They may have 3 or 4. How do we, I mean, wouldn't it be better if we looked at the poverty of opportunity rather than poverty of consumption? How can we do that? Any thoughts on that?
I do have some thoughts on that. I think the first thing is that we need to change the definition of inclusion, because when all the development rhetoric talks about inclusive growth, that is a huge constructive ambiguity. So some people mean by inclusive growth, we let the market rip, whatever the market outcomes are determined, and then we have some cash transfer programs. So it's all post-tax transfer as the generator of equality. Whereas I think the thing we should be focused on is inclusion into the productive economy. That's what we should focus on, inclusion. The way we eliminate poverty, the way we create, a stable middle class is, by augmenting the productivity of the economy and augmenting the opportunity of people to join into the productive economy. So lots of economies now are sort of dual economies in which there's some favored investors or favored sectors, and then the rest of the population is forced to scrabble around in street vendors and whatnot. And we just don't have a mechanism for saying, poverty is not, what high productivity economies are highly productive because they have people embedded into large complex value chains. So the emphasis of inclusions should be not how do I make you marginally less poor, but how do I include you into the productive economy? All of a sudden, issues like urbanization, like infrastructure, transport infrastructure, then all of a sudden, these core development issues get seen as inclusion issues. Overregulation, for instance. If we're denying people the opportunity to, start and run and freely operate by regulation, that's an inclusion problem. We're excluding people from the productive economy, right? So I think that's the first thing is we need to reframe the issue of around what does inclusion mean? And inclusion doesn't mean we're not concerned about your productivity because we'll make up and we'll have your consumption be higher than your market outcome by giving you a cash grant. Like that's not what inclusion should be about. Inclusion is about inclusion into a productive economy, which then brings all the basics of how does a person get what are the available jobs? How does the person get the job? How does the person get to the job? How does the person get home from the job? All the core issues of development that, were really the right issues to be focused on. Like, what does a, inclusive pattern of urbanization look like? What does inclusive infrastructure look like? Come to the fore. I think now we have other questions.
Yeah, we do indeed. Let's go to Shahid.
Oh, thank you, Lant, for this very interesting and very informative presentation. As always, it's a pleasure listening to you on a very important topic. So, I have two questions for you, and one and this is one of the things that you just mentioned, and a pretty interesting one was the value chains, and it's somewhat related to, my question is somewhat related to domestic commerce. We did a study in PIDE. I'm sorry, just to introduce myself, I'm a research fellow at Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. PIDE, Shahid Mahmood is my name. So we did a study on domestic commerce and domestic economy, and what we found at PIDE was the way it should be utilized in the area constituting Pakistan, in the geographic region constituting Pakistan, it's not being utilized that way. All those value chains, all those commercial aspects, all that, the way it should be utilized. And so, in your opinion, wouldn't it be better, instead of running cash support programs for the poor, wouldn't it be better to emphasize on developing the domestic economy and its value chains so that more people can find opportunities? And my next question, countries like Pakistan still do a lot of Soviet style central planning. So we have our yearly plans, then we have our 5 years and 10 years plan, not 10-year plan, but 5-year plans. And we also have our yearly public sector development programs. So basically, it's centralized planning. So how do you see that in context of poverty reduction and generation of opportunities to reduce poverty? Thank you.
So first, I think it's just coming back to what we were saying is that the the way people get jobs is by there being productive firms, right? And job is usually an employment relation. So if we've created a mechanism where it's difficult in the domestic value chains to create large, sophisticated, productive firms, then we're blocking the avenue of job creation, independently of whether or not the labor market actually works. So I think again, going to a focus on how am I going to create productive jobs and then get people into those productive jobs is the way I would kind of reframe merely everything we're discussing. So rather than thinking, how do I mitigate? And again, I would focus more on jobs inside a growing, vibrant, dynamic private sector than I would necessarily on, there's this very, again, lots of the field of development flourishes on constructive ambiguity, where people are saying what sounds like the same thing and meaning radically different things. A lot of the support to small scale entrepreneurs is acting as if one person alone with a dollop of microcredit can become radically more productive. It's like, no, that's not how you get more productive. You get more productive by embedding yourself more effectively in a productive value chain. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, governments have to have planning processes. They have to have some way of at least debating about what the allocation of scarce public resources are. I remember I came to Pakistan some years ago when Dr. Al-Haq was at the Planning Commission and tried to, how would you even think about, we're so incredibly tightly constrained on public resources. But the way I would change it is from more a binding constraints to growth approach, which is, are we allocating public sector resources that are going to be maximally productive in creating a growing, vibrant, productive private sector? And so, and the binding constraint approach, I think, sort of says, yeah, you need everything, but the planning approach of trying to get to everything by doing everything ends up, overtaxing the public sector. Whereas the public sector, if I had a mechanism of saying, our planning process is to try and focus on what we believe would be the alleviating the binding constraint to accelerated growth in Pakistan, I think that would give you a much better way of allocating public resources, where you acknowledge that the main role of the public sector is going to be facilitative rather than direct. So, other questions?
Nasir Iqbal.
Yeah, thank you so much for excellent presentation. So I was just looking how we define this poverty, and as you mentioned that when you simulate it, it turn out to be a different as compared to the actual number. If it's standard practice, it's 4% below the poverty line, and if you simulate it up to 7%, 8%, 10%. But what I feel in terms of the definitional issue is how we like allocate weight to the different commodity. Like for example, I'll give you the one example, like mobile phone. Your cell phone is like 10 year back it was like some sort of luxury good, but now it become a part of a necessity. Similar few other products that over the period of time they are changing in their nature, but the static nature of poverty definition and the concept would not cater these kind of changes, but we are simply trying to allocate the same units. For example, as you mentioned, $1 a day, $1.5 2 days. The World Bank that predominantly is following the same definition. Even in the Pakistan, we have the standard practice of allocating the same style of weight to these commodities, but it over the period of time it changes. It didn't reflect within the definition. So how we can cope with these type of changes that become very relevant with the passage of time? If we didn't incorporate within that concept, it might be we will end up maybe the misleading result, the number that we are actually getting out of this. The second part that rightly mentioned, Dr. Nadeem, is like that the opportunity. Where is the opportunity? And the street vendor gave the example is one of the way to actually like empower these people to break these vicious circle. And we did study in this Islamabad and Rawalpindi, and there like the minimum wage is much higher than the earning are much higher than the minimum wage rate that the government set. Secondly, the major issue that Dr. Nadeem also highlighted, the constraint that they are facing, and the one of the key component that come out of that study is around 60 to 70% of their cost is primarily linked with the administrative issues. Either they pay these rent to the shopkeeper, or they pay these rent to the district administration and the other law enforcing agency for just for holding those type of businesses. So how you respond these two key issues, how we can facilitate, and the first way how we can revisit this concept of poverty, keeping in view the changing nature of commodities and their importance within the basket. Thank you.
First of all, in the discourse of within Pakistan and Pakistan with its development partners, I think there's a couple of things. First, if I were the Pakistan government, I would just tell every development partner, we're using your poverty line. You want to be here and do development and you're from the UK? Our Pakistan ambition is your poverty line. And say, why should we have a lower aspiration for our citizens than you have for yours? So first of all, I think at the rhetorical level in the global forum, Pakistan should just start saying, no, we're not accepting any poverty line of the development ambitions of Pakistan that isn't your poverty line. So that's mainly rhetorical for the goals. Second, I think internal discussion, if I were the Pakistan government, I would create a poverty line where the opposite of poverty is prosperity, right? And so I would say, we're going to have, a destitution line that is maybe something like the existing poverty line. But that's not our real goal. Our real goal is that Pakistani citizens be prosperous, and we're going to create a prosperity line. And we want to get more people into prosperity. And then you have a flexibility, since you're defining a new prosperity line, to include in it, what does what does a person really have aspirations to live a modicum, decent lifestyle in terms of access to electricity, access to interior water and sanitation, access to a cell phone. And then you don't have to go down the game of trying to recreate a different poverty line. Create a prosperity line and say, there's different gradations of poverty, but the real opposite of poverty is prosperity. So in a companion paper to the one you're seeing, we're trying to do this at the global level of say, look, if what we mean by poverty is that above this, we think your income gains are less important, and so we're not going to be as focused on them as the income lanes below this poverty line, let's actually create a poverty line where we really believe the kind of importance of gains to income above that line are pretty near zero. So let's create, a prosperity line. And when you do that, even with simple basic functions that everybody agree are part of a standard aspiration, you end up with a poverty line that's 10 times higher. 10 times at least. So then, again, you create a different discourse. It's like, look, we have some concern with the poorest of the poor and the destitution, but that's not our only ambition as a government and as a society and as a country. We also want to increase prosperity. And then, PIDE or other organizations could start, okay, what would a prosperity line in Pakistan? Let's rebuild a bundle that looks like a prosperity line and start measuring the people above the prosperity line. And then you'd realize, a prosperity line in Pakistan that looked like a poverty line in the US would make, nearly all Pakistanis be below the prosperity line. And then it would create a broad-based vision, again, of what needs to happen that isn't going to be, it breaks this kind of targeting, transfer, distributive mentality towards a more shared prosperity, shared productivity, shared public goods mentality of what Pakistan needs. The other question is, I think on the other side, it just, I think framing the deregulation and getting rid of the petty corruption and the obstacles to business as an inclusion agenda is I think going to make more traction of like, look, we just want the population of Pakistan to be able to work productively. And for that, we just need to make it a lot easier for people to hire people into complex value chains, into large scale firms and we can't, we can't set all these discretionary obstacles that overregulation create all kinds of opportunities for both hampering business and creating corruption. But again, it is the opportunity agenda. I mean, it's not, it's crazy to me that the overregulation agenda should be the left-wing agenda, right? It should be like, really, if we want opportunity and inclusion and people really participating in the modern economy, we need to make the modern economy much more vibrant and open. And for that, we need, if a binding constraint is the burden laid by regulation, then that's not a left versus right kind of agenda. That's a common agenda.
Good point. Ahmed Faraz?
Sir, sir, a very, very good session and a very informative debate here. I have a quick question. Some of things that individuals and governments can help to reduce the poverty, but I have some certain different question that there are cooperation and globalization, and then my question is about that how globalization influence the poverty levels in Pakistan. Do you think that it will help on vulnerable communities within the countries? Like we talk about government regulations and individuals, that these companies can help, that big companies we are talking about, that how this globalization can help a country to reduce the poverty level. I have the quick question. Thank you.
So I think the answer is, and it's gotten, I think, harder over time. So I think a globalization, one of the key questions for any country in the world is, how can I take the labor that exists in my country and embed it into value creating processes that produces something I can sell to the rest of the world? If you can't answer that question coherently, it's very hard to see how you're going to go about economic growth that's really going to produce poverty reduction, because that's what creates jobs, right? So I think the globalization agenda is very much that agenda, because it's a productivity, fundamentally the globalization agenda is a productivity agenda, because it's a productivity agenda because you have to ask yourself, how do I make Pakistani labor productive? Right? Productive in value creation. And the thing globalization gives you is it gives you a concrete target, meaning it says, we know we're productive, and when we can, embed Pakistani labor in services and value things and sell it. So I think that sense of globalization, it's a powerful driver of a productivity agenda. right? And not for globalization per se, but as a metric of performance of improving productivity. Now, the way this has gotten trickier is three ways. One, the rules-based system for trade that existed and was created in the post-war era is rapidly deteriorating, so that you can't be reliant on the neutral rules of world trade anymore. So Pakistan does need to worry, is it globalizing in a way that's really going to be relevant to the future? And are we have secure trade channels? The second thing is, you know, the low wage path to globalization has gotten harder. Just if you look back at the Koreas of the world in 1960s, they were, you know, Korean labor was competing with French labor. And there it was relatively easy. Now, at this stage, Pakistan is competing with the people who have displaced, you know, Pakistani labor is not competing with US labor. Pakistani labor is competing with Bangladeshi labor, with Indian labor, with Chinese labor, with Vietnamese labor. So I think that's the second way in which the globalization path is harder. But then third, on the counter side of that, I think in Pakistan, I think you want to broaden the agenda to get away from the assumption that the path to globalization is just exports of goods. You know, you need to say two other things. One, exports of services. And the second is, how can we actually maybe move Pakistanis to other places and have them do the labor actually in these other countries and return the remittances to Pakistan? So another one of my agendas is, I think migration is a productivity improvement. You know, if Pakistani can move to a more productive country, that should be seen not as a failure of Pakistan, but in the future of the world, Pakistan has a demographic bulge, whereas all rich countries in the world are having a demographic crunch. So I think Pakistan should think strategically about how are we going to embed Pakistani labor in valued production of goods, in valued production of services, and in the production of services abroad as a threefold strategy.
Let me see. We got one person from India. Lovely. Ankit Singh. Ankit, please welcome to Pakistan.
I'm actually sitting in India, so they could have
Good.
just come to the
No,
door.
but we welcome this cross-border dialogue. At least
There
we
you
can do it.
go.
Even if politics doesn't allow it, we can do it. So Ankit, please welcome.
Thank you for your wishes, sir. Thank you. I just have a comment and a question leading to that. So I want to start my comment from a structuralist point of view. I've been reading on trade and politics in South Asia in 18th and 17th century, and I read as Dutch, you know, blockaded the eastern front of the trade, which was extensively like the trade, at least for in the Mughal, empire, was mostly directed through Surat and then to the West Asia. But as the blockade came and China came to displace that network, and then most of the products which were produced in India shifted to the eastern coast of India. So my point is the disruptions were there. Like today, globalization has disrupted something. So disruptions has been there. So do you think the problem goes deeper than, you know, the recent globalization and interconnectedness and intensive connectivity which spurred after the 1950s? Do you think the problem goes deeper than that? That idea of, you know, inequality and a discourse on development is not a recent one, but has been there, at least from a South Asian perspective. Your comment on that, sir. Thank you. Oh, the reading was by Athar Ali and Sanjay Subramaniam.
I take your comment and in kind of the perspective. I think, and maybe I misunderstood, but I do think the structure of global production is going to be a determinant of where Pakistan at this stage can fit into and you know, one of the other sort of uphill headwinds is, you know, in an aggregate sense, the OECD is no longer going to be the engine of growth in export markets that it used to be, just for the mere consequence that it's demographically shrinking and their growth rates are slow. So I do think the structure of world trade is going to shift away to a significant extent from the OECD to other markets that are going to be maybe even harder to penetrate for Pakistan than others. I'm not sure if that's exactly responsive, but I think, looking ahead, and I also I don't want to be heard as overemphasizing exports either. I think improving, in the end, huge amounts of any economy are non-traded goods and services. And so I think improving productivity within the domestic industries and inside Pakistan is hugely important as well, as opposed to the kind of fragmented markets and firms that one might have. So, other questions?
Let me check. Yes, Alia Khan.
Yes, thank you, Professor Pritchett. I thought I would ask you a question based on my experience with a poverty estimation committee, which the government of Pakistan convened. And I know Nadeem has his own views about it, but I think it was a useful exercise in the sense that poverty mapping can reveal certain facets which normally do not feed into policy making. And I'm not referring to the poverty line debate, but what we did was that we, besides the poverty measures, we also estimated the inequality measures and the multidimensional poverty index. And when you juxtapose the poverty mapping in such a way, then it is useful for policy purposes. So just wanted your, off the top comments on that. Thank you very much.
I guess the main thing I'm pushing back against is an exclusive or dominant focus on low bar poverty lines. So I think mapping overall metrics of human well-being, like in a multi-dimension index, I think that's really useful. But again, I'm very suspicious of drawing low bar lines, because development isn't just about getting people over a low bar. Let me just tell, and so I'm not saying that these kinds of analysis of issues around inequality, issues around access to services, issues around poverty mapping are not fruitful, but I'm saying they're made less fruitful the more pressure there is from the global community and internally to drive those thresholds down. So let me just tell a story that I often tell. I was working for the World Bank, living in India about 20 years ago, and we were talking about just designing a development project in the routine way. You talk about, okay, what are we going to do with this project? And, I wanted the project to be designed in a way that would strengthen the capability of the Panchayat Raj institutions, the locally elected governments, to be engaged in this important service of water supply. And my colleagues at the bank were looking to create project structures, right, that delivered the project more effectively, but really were basically, work around the fact that the existing governmental structures were weak. But in the end, it was going to deliver, and so we were discussing, like, how would we go about designing this very, straightforward development project of, like, water. And after about an hour of the debate, I said, well, maybe we're not getting anywhere. So tell me what your vision of water in India is. And they said, well, our vision is every person in India lives within a quarter, half a kilometer of an improved water source that can produce 40 liters a day of water. And I was like, well, I see why we can't agree on how to design a development project, because my vision of water in India is everyone can take a hot shower inside their house. And, what you're doing isn't the path to my vision. My vision actually requires highly functionalized, highly productive, organization and institutions providing 24/7 safe piped water to houses. That's where everybody wants to get. And if the way you're doing your vision isn't on the way to my vision, it's not really development. It's mitigating the consequences of the lack of development. And that's a confusion I think that we've allowed to fester here, is what's mitigating the consequences of the lack of development and what's promoting development. So I agree multidimensional indices can be useful in identifying, lacuna in the government policy process that could bring important improvements to human well-being if we could provide effectively those public goods. But if you define it down, the further down you define it, the less relevant it is to the broader ambitions of the country, the less enthusiasm there is for it. So I'm for, more emphasis on functioning mechanisms that serve the broad interests rather than targeted mechanisms. And I think a multidimensional index that has just low levels, like just the only goal for water is, people walking with a pail to get it from a standpipe and carrying it home. That's nobody's ambition. That's nobody's goal. So I think it's not about the analysis. It's partly is how low are we kind of pushing the boundaries of what we consider the acceptable lifestyle that the aspiration of policy is to produce.
Thank you, Lant. I won't take any more questions, but just before I let you go, Lant, let me just quickly ask you one last question, which I think is very critical for people to hear from you. I think you've successfully buried poverty lines, and I'm so happy you made me my day today. That's wonderful. Great. We should fundamentally discontinue this discontinuity that has been created, and that has been the focus of so much policy in the last so many years. But related to that, I think perhaps you should also do us a favor and try and bury development economics, because I really don't know what development economics is doing. These indices that we see, for example, are they really helping us or hurting us? Let me put it this way. Development economics has become very project focused. The world used to be policy focused. Now we have so many projects, but no policy. And I keep worrying about it. We've mapped out there are 100 donors sitting in Islamabad. And they're lenders. They're not donors, really. They're lenders. And they come with, they've got, if I remember right, they've got each project that they have on average is $2 million. And they're pushing the government agendas in the government. And these projects are driving our policy up. I think I was in the planning commission too. I didn't know whether to look left or right, because I was inundated by donors every day. I didn't have the time to think or do. And this is what's happening here. And I think you'll remember, I think Kamal Darwish, when he went to the Turkey, he actually banned World Bank missions. He said, hey, guys, there are too many of you. I can't talk to you, right? So, I mean, I think there's a huge amount of not only development loans, but also technical assistance, which never seems to end. So there are lots of consultants who are here, and they're, the variation in quality is huge. And as you know, this woman, Mazakuto, has written a very nice book on Mazukata. I think I'm pronouncing the name wrong. Written a very good book on the consulting business. But I want to go to two things, basically. One is the project focus. Two, would you agree with me? I have this feeling that development economics is very mercantilist in origin. I mean, it seems to have a mercantilist focus. We are trying to isomorphic mimicry, but two, we are also trying to do things to sell to the Western world, and trying to con the Western world, and not really have a holistic development focus. And I'll give you a little story of my own on the holistic focus, which is also very interesting. We keep talking about including women, for example. This goes back to my public goods problem. Now, we found, for example, and we were advocating for a long time, I was advocating here, look, let the city develop, let the city develop. You can't include women without cities. But the World Bank comes along with charity proposals to include women, and it's not happening. But we started, only recently, we started building shopping malls. And now shopping malls have started including women. Women come in their hijab to the shopping mall, then they change into modern clothes, and they're quite happy to be serving in the shopping mall because they feel it's a safe environment. But they won't go to an ordinary shop in the wayside because it's obviously not safe. So I mean, this goes back to that. But is development my question to you is development economics mercantilist? And what would you advise us students Should they be focusing on development or learning plain economics?
So I think the answer to this is, when I said it, economics is no longer economics. Economics is not a project science. Economics is a system science. When we study, economics is fundamentally about studying the emergent properties of complex systems. And that involves the ways in which individuals interact via rules and ways in which human beings cooperate via firms, via markets, via financial transactions. The fundamental drive of economics is to understand how people cooperate over time and space to join their efforts to produce prosperity. That's what economics is about. Economics is not about identifying the impact on a specific individual, right? So I was going to reach through the camera and give you a big kiss, because exactly the problem, the development economics has become too project focused and not enough policy focused, not enough, and so I think what Pakistan should say is, here are, the way in which we're going to get prosperous is we're going to have a productive economy that people can be included into. We're going to have a state that's capable as organizations of carrying out the core functions of government. And we're going to have a polity that can accurately reflect the needs and wishes of citizens. And when donors come to you and say, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to do that, Pakistan has to be able to say, is what you're doing on the path to what we want? And if it's not, we're not going to do it because you want to do it, right? I think I'm just 100%, and the way in which the thinking organizations in the South, like PIDE, can cooperate to change the global discourse, to get away from this mitigationist, low bar, project focused approach to a policy, long-term transformation, society-wide approach. Anything we can do to cooperate to change that discourse is going to be hugely important, because again, economists, if this RCT stuff were being done by, graduate students in public health from Kansas State University, I'd be all for it. But that's not what, economics is a science about cooperation, about systems, about, emergent outcomes. And we've lost that vision in the interests of, getting into the granular detail of project design, which just isn't, if you ask why countries are some successful and others aren't, it just isn't that these do good projects and these do bad projects. That's just stupid. It's just stupid. And how we escape from that stupidity is a hard question, because unfortunately, the proponents of this, charity approach now control the means of publication.
That's a very good point. Lant, thank you very much.
Okay.
It's been a wonderful seminar as always. You've always been very, very provocative and very creative and very thoughtful. Please continue to do so. And please continue to regard PID with favor. And my final point to you,
I hope we'll look for an occasion to get me to Pakistan.
Please come. We'll do that.
More about Pakistan in Pakistan would be better. I'm very sorry.
We'll inshallah do that. My final request to you is, please tell Indian colleagues there we need to participate together. Forget the politics, that's another realm. Zoom has provided us the opportunity, so we must get together and have more conferences. Okay. I keep trying to do that too. Thank you, Lant. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.